Today, we take up the paradigm of liberalism and what it has to say about war and its causes. Liberalism is, of course, like realism, a modern paradigm of international relations. Despite liberal claims that its founding father is Immanuel Kant, it really has its roots in 19th century radical thought, in particular the writings and politics of Richard Cobden and John Bright. I will elaborate on this, look at some of the assumptions made by the liberal paradigm, and focus in particular on its implications for war and international order. In doing this, I'm going to address, among other things, the democratic peace paradigm and the question of the extent to which there is an American-led liberal world order and what its consequences have been. So let's start by clearing the underbrush here and looking at Immanuel Kant, whose famous argument for perpetual peace is taken by liberals as a starting point for their paradigm. In fact, as Sean Malloy has convincingly shown in his book Kant's International Relations, Kant was primarily a religious thinker who thought that world peace would not be a function of the rise of trading states, but the consequence of a moral transformation of humankind, that trading and peace would follow. Liberals have misread Kant and put it in reverse order. Bright and Cobden and later Woodrow Wilson are legitimately considered fathers of the liberal paradigm, but we can step back further and put them in perspective that ties liberalism into fundamental assumptions of modernity. You, I hope, will remember that in my discussion of Thucydides and also of Clausewitz, I talked about the ancient Greek conception of the human mind. People were thought to have three fundamental motives: appetite, which we all understand; thumos, which pertain to our desire for self-esteem, generally achieved by excelling in activities valued by our peer group and society. By doing so and winning the approbation of others, we in turn feel good about ourselves. The ancient Greeks also theorized reason as a drive. And here they distinguish between what we moderns following Max Weber describe as instrumental reason, the kind of reason that connects the goals you seek with the external world and makes it easier for you to achieve them. They distinguished instrumental reason from a more fundamental kind of reason, which sought to understand what made for a good and happy life, to initially constrain and then educate appetite and thumos to collaborate toward that end. What happened in the modern era, beginning really with Cervantes' Don Quixote and then followed through Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, was an effort to change the hierarchy of drives. The ancient Greeks thought that appetite was a very threatening kind of drive because appetites can rarely, if ever, be fulfilled. You have money, you want more money, even if you don't need it to to buy things. And the same with food, sex, housing, accumulation of these kinds of things continues and often becomes competitive, making people slaves of their appetites rather than their masters. So the ancients reasoned that appetites needed to be constrained, that primacy should be given to thumos, self-esteem, because self-esteem was something achieved in the eyes of others and therefore required a degree of public service, of solidarity with one's community, and an intellectual understanding that achieving these goals meant that you had to help others do so within the broader community that gave your life meaning. With modernity and the rise of commercial classes, there was an attempt by, you could use Marx's term of the bourgeoisie, to assert their right to both status and power against the aristocracy, which still in most countries held closely all the reins of power. By vaunting appetite and undercutting thumos, you created the ideological conditions for the bourgeoisie to legitimize and advance its claim on power. So writers and theorists focused on the evil consequences of thumos. In effect, it led aristocrats to seek glory through wars. And they were right, the critics. If we look at the 18th century, we have wars of competition among aristocratic leaders and kings, in which people are just cannon fodder, all fought to justify claims of relative standing among this small elite. Thinkers like Mandeville, Adam Smith, David Hume argued that appetite, by contrast, was beneficial because it brought about wealth for everyone. We have the famous retold story of Adam Smith's baker, who's motivated perhaps by greed, but in producing good bread that sells, makes a living. When many people are motivated this way and contribute to the economy, it has an overall effect at the social level to make the country richer. Wealth and business was seen to require peace because people can't trade very well in times of war. They're afraid to make investments. There's chaos. So these theorists reasoned, and here's where Bright and Cobden come into the picture, that a country that had people primarily concerned with their economic advancement would be people who supported peace. They didn't want themselves or their sons to die in wars, and they wanted peace and tranquility so that economic progress could be made. This, of course, required democracy to transform it into practice, because as long as aristocrats were in power, foreign policy would be based on a very different set of goals and principles. The expectation of the liberals was that once full franchise was established, that the people who would be elected would be responsible to the electorate and therefore would pursue peaceful policies because it was in their interest to get elected. So it followed further that in a world of democratic states, there would be strong incentives for peace among all of its members. Now, of course, this is the premise of the Democratic Peace Program. It broke in the West with a great clap of thunder when first Rudy Rummel and then others seemed to discover this empirical finding that democratic states don't wage wars against other democracies. This seemed evidence of the claims that had been made by liberal theorists. It started a major industry in research, initially to document and nail down this belief, but also to respond to the critics who raised, and still do, all kinds of questions about either the legitimacy or the meaning of these empirical findings. This is a vast issue and often a very technical one, so I'll limit myself to providing a very superficial overview. Most of the early research looked at dyads, so they had a list of countries that existed in every year, and they coded the ones that were democracies. They then paired each country against every other country, asking if it was at war or at peace that year. They found, doing this starting often in